Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bill Clifford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America in Washington, D.C. I come to you today from our office downtown, and it's my pleasure to present to you the first edition of Embassy Row Live of 2021. If you've not been writing your checks and your dates correctly, you'd be like me, but we are in a new year. It is a most amazing and harrowing and grim new year in Washington. And we have a special guest for you today who will talk about U.S.-Egyptian relations, the Middle East, and all manner of global issues. It's my great pleasure to welcome and present to you Ambassador Motaz Zahran. Ambassador Zahran is, as of September 17 last year, the Egyptian ambassador to the United States. Prior to this appointment, he served as Assistant Foreign Minister and Chief of Cabinet at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Cairo. Previously, he was Ambassador of Egypt to Canada, and he has also served here at the Embassy in Washington, D.C. in a number of roles as political counselor, congressional affairs officer, and chargé d'affaires. During his distinguished diplomatic career, he has 4 times served in the cabinet of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and from 2001 to 2005, he was in the Embassy of Egypt in New Delhi, India. Ambassador Zahran has also worked at the Office of the Assistant Foreign Minister for Arab and Middle Eastern Affairs and the Permanent Mission of Egypt to the League of Arab States in Cairo, as well as the United Nations in New York. He's an expert in disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation and international security issues, but his brief as ambassador, of course, is much wider and broader and deeper than that. Ambassador Zahran, it is truly a pleasure to welcome you to Embassy Row Live, WACA's program with distinguished ambassadors such as you.
Well, thank you, Bill, for your kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me today. I'm delighted to be with you, and I'm of course just over my 3 month already in Washington, so it's a privilege to be here and to have this talk on the Middle East and Egypt, U.S. This is of course my first engagement with World Affairs Council, and as I've said, I've just assumed responsibilities over 3 months ago. But what comes to mind at this outset is in fact Shirley Bassey's soundtrack, and the question she posed in it was, where do I begin? So where do I begin? That is an important question. And allow me at the outset here to offer condolences for the tragic loss of life in the storming of Capitol Hill a few days back, an attack on the symbol of U.S. identity, U.S. unity, U.S. democracy and governance. So basically, unprecedented historic presidential elections, a raging global pandemic, unparalleled scenes gripping the political scene in Washington, a global economic slowdown as a result of COVID, and all of this in the midst of a volatile international order. But despite having served in Washington before, I believed in the past tense, I possessed a solid idea of what awaits me. But now into the mission, let me tell you that my Washington 2.0 has been quite the ride. Unprecedented is probably an understatement. But coming to think of it, I believe what we are witnessing nowadays is a hallmark of the past decade. Our ability to predict and to project and to foresee into the future in terms of political and social developments have substantially diminished, particularly in a world that witnesses a close interconnectivity between domestic and international variables. The parameters, the dynamics that we were previously had taken for granted as solid foundations governing both local and global events are no longer no longer reliable. If there's any region in the world that epitomizes this unpredictability, it is the Middle East. The last decade witnessed a series of events and developments that have fundamentally changed the entire ecosystem of the region. The power dynamics, the security challenges, the geopolitical contestations, and shifting alliances. But within this paradigm shift in the Middle East, one cannot but realize that the solid constant in US Middle Eastern relations, US Arab relations, remains in a very few. And let me just tell you that prime here is the strategic relationship between both Egypt and the US, the importance of which one cannot overemphasize. It is based on a solid foundation of mutual interests, in addition to the broader objectives in the region of peace, security, and stability and prosperity. And as a brief example, our relationship has basically transformed the Arab-Israeli conflict from a mode of outright confrontation to a phase of working towards peace. We have embraced and welcomed the latest strides on the peace front. But after all, what is Egypt here? Egypt has always been the pathfinder, the trailblazer, and by weathering and withstanding the huge regional backlash, we've been able, by virtue of solid convictions and resilience, to transform mindsets, albeit by the passage of decades. It was Egypt that led the initial transformation by taking bold, progressive, and unprecedented steps to alter the course for future generations from a future of war, conflict, and a struggle to a future of promise, hope, and prosperity. Before touching upon specific areas of regional conflict and tension, let me briefly depict the prevailing trends in the Middle East. Well, the Middle East is a region engulfed by an unprecedented level of violence and instability. This is largely fueled by three problematic trends that have proven to be an overriding source of instability in the Middle East for the past decade. First is the dismantlement of the nation state, and I will probably not enter into the details to allow time for a conversation later on. But second is the inclination of some regional actors to pursue outright hegemony. And third is the proliferation of violent non-state actors in the region. But and let me just say here, as I've touched upon these three trends that are unfortunately prevailing, that Egypt, in the midst of all of this, has never sought to dominate the scene in the region. Unlike others, it does not and has not and will not seek hegemony, regional hegemony. What it seeks is to consolidate mutually beneficial partnerships with its neighbors, to respect and uphold the principle of international law, topped by non-interference in internal affairs of whether in the region or beyond. And here I'd like to very briefly touch upon the Biden foreign policy platform, which I think is very interesting. Well, given these trends, there is a platform that has been out there for some time, and we've all studied it, we've all looked at it, and we've all had our takes on what it actually says. It reflects priorities. And when you look at the Middle East in the platform, you will find that the Middle East is probably the last on the list. But at the same time, you see Iran on its own figuring high on the same list, which begs intellect here to try to decipher how Iran will be dissected in policy from the rest of the Middle East, specifically given a number of factors. Iran and the future of JCPOA, revamped or not, is not solely a question about the nuclear program. And this is a fact that we've seen play out throughout, all the engagements that have happened with Iran in the past. So Iran's regional behavior, destabilizing and destructive, is something that needs not to be away from the whole approach. The whole approach should encompass what Iran does in its region, whether in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, or other places in the region. Now, a third element here is Turkey, and Turkey is no alien to this kind of depiction. You just add Libya, Eastern Mediterranean, Greece, and Cyprus, and you'll get a similar kind of assessment. So how to reconcile between Iran, that seems to be a priority, and the Middle East seemingly lingering a bit behind, will be a challenge. Once again, after previously pivoting to Asia, lesser engagement with the Middle East has only led to embolden these regional players and invited others, thereby exacerbating tensions and conflicts and instability. In Libya, for example, even while the very core of our national security in Egypt was threatened by the events in Libya, Egypt did not resort to force. Instead, the president of Egypt has announced a prudent red line that constituted, in effect, a call for peace, preventing advances from west to east and from east to west, both alike. So this planted the seeds of what today we see as a ceasefire that we need to cement, and the resumption of talks between the LNA and GNA in Libya. Both of them were hosted in Egypt for the purpose. Now in Syria, it's the same thing. Egypt is part of this small group, works steadfastly with its partner to push for a peaceful resolution to the conflict in line with Security Council Resolution 2254, famous 2254. It has engaged positively and proactively through diplomacy to chart a way for the Syrian people out of the nightmare. And I can spare right now in the initial remarks the details. But when it comes to the question of Palestine, I've just mentioned who was the trailblazer and who was the pathfinder, and accordingly the embracement of Egypt of the peace drive. And we think that from the peace drive that has happened lately with a number of Arab states with Israel, we should be able to forge and tackle and put the core issue in the Middle East on the table for discussions, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now we need to work, and Egypt has just hosted yesterday the small group, which is called the Munich Group, in order to move ahead with a plan for the future. Now, one of the issues that Egypt has been a bit occupied with is the GERD. And let me just, the GERD, which is the Grand Ethiopian Dam. Let me just say that the negotiations have not gone too far. Basically, the agreements we had in the past, the principles that we've agreed to with the Ethiopians in the past, basically call for the 3 or 4 main pillars to guide us. Negotiations in good faith, no significant harm on any of the riparian states, and the need for a legally binding instrument to be forged with, of course, a conflict resolution mechanism, and no unilateral actions should be taken. So we continue to pursue negotiations. However, they're not very promising. On counterterrorism, very quickly on counterterrorism, we think that counterterrorism is not only an obligation in the context of protecting our national security, but we also see it, and we're focused in tandem as we advance in the fight against terror, and a parallel advancement in the whole gamut of human rights. Prime among them is the most basic human right, which is the right to life. So as we are fully aware that the promotion of human rights contributes to the eradication of terrorism and its spread, we need to continue to advance in a much more progressive way, given our recognition of the flaws and the imperfections and the deficiencies that we have. But it's an ongoing process that we need to continue to work on very diligently. Now, let me just make a quick reference to Egypt-US, and let me just say that the future of Egypt-US relations rests on the political will of both sides. This is a relationship that must continue and must be governed by the individual assessment of the degree to which their objectives and interests are being fulfilled through this relationship, Egypt as a regional power and the US as a global one. I believe that conventional wisdom needs to and will in fact prevail to the effect that these interests will continue to be served and drive them to engage each other in a fashion that is constructive as it has always been. For Egypt's regional leadership is best asserted by furnishing the model it's actually shaping today, an enlightened state regaining its sources of soft and hard power combined in what today is termed as smart power, engaging, of course, on intellectual and cultural platforms and redefining our compassion, of course, to our religious identity, thus unleashing the full potential. And I think this is what the US needs in a reliable partner in the region. And I would like to make a reference that the president of Egypt had reached out amongst the very first of leaders to congratulate President-elect Biden on his election and vowing to work constructively in advancing this relationship together. So these are initial remarks that I thought to make at the very beginning, and I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Ambassador Zahran, thank you for that tour d'horizon, and I appreciate your sharing these views with us on not just U.S.-Egyptian relations, but also your perspective on the Middle East and some of the conflicts in the region. Looking at how you regarded the relationship with the U.S. in general, and you mentioned that a lot will rest on the political will and the assessment of national interests and so forth. I wonder if you could make an assessment of the Trump administration's foreign policy toward Egypt and the region. In many ways, some here have said that it was not isolationist, but that the U.S. did not consider using the influence that it could have, that it shifted in some ways under Obama towards Asia. How do you evaluate the policies of the Trump administration in terms of the advancement of democratic values in terms of security and counterterrorism and the like?
Well, thank you very much. I think that this is a relationship between both countries, both nations. It is one that is based on interests. It is based on common objectives. It is based on peace. And we've always had throughout history and throughout the decades, at least over 4 decades now, a solid relationship that is premised basically on the need to advance peace and security and stability and prosperity in the Middle East. It is one that has catered to the interests of both countries. And we have worked all along throughout these decades with both Democratic and Republican administrations. There have been heights and lows. There has been differences. There has been also a lot of seeing eye to eye on a number of issues. So these differences have never detracted any of the two states away from the essential trajectory of this relationship. And when we have had well, let me rephrase. Let me just say that and you've referred to that, and I've referred to it as well, as the US has pivoted towards Asia at a certain point of time, what has happened in the Middle East in general is that this has created a vacuum. And this vacuum was filled regionally by regional powers, and it was filled also by global powers. And this has only exacerbated all the situation in the Middle East. It has created much more grounds for conflicts to continue to grow, as opposed to trying to settle these conflicts. When the Trump administration took power, I think the relationship continued to be steady. And even at times when we had differences in the past, this steady nature of this relationship continued to prevail because it simply catered to the interests of both. There are important issues that the Trump administration gave attention to, and basically it's the GERD issue. And when it comes to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, they've given that issue heightened attention here in the US, and we had in Egypt a serious problem. And that serious problem stemmed, in fact, from the basic nature of the problem, which is it not being for Egypt a developmental issue, but being an existential issue. It's not an issue that had an impact only on our national security, but on our livelihood and life in Egypt in general. Without the flow of the waters of the Nile, there wouldn't be life in Egypt. And that is probably what made the Trump administration so interested in being present in the negotiations, taking part in the negotiation, and offering actually what the Trump administration saw as a good middle ground in a document here in Washington, D.C. And of course, all this was appreciated by Egypt, and Egypt continued throughout the whole process to assert its conviction that this problem should and will, by the presence and by the display of good, a good solid political will on all sides, to be resolved peacefully. So we've always been attached to that peaceful nature of the resolution of the GERD issues, and we continue to be guided by that principle, despite the fact that the GERD negotiations, as of today, are going nowhere. So basically, a Trump administration that was beneficial towards one existential issue that Egypt had faced, fully engaged in it, and it was appreciated. And what we think in the future, that the Biden administration would see merit in continuing to play a constructive role of a medium in terms of bringing the three parties together. When it comes to peace in the Middle East as well, there were strides that have happened lately. We've welcomed them. And we've always seen that the core issue here, which is the Palestinian issue, should not subside, should always be at the forefront of attention. And what we think in the future, and as we project with the new administration, we think that attention should be given to how to reinvigorate a peace process once again. So basically saying that the interests have also lied in the other conflicts in the region. We've seen differently on different other issues when it comes to Syria, when it comes to the role that other regional players play. And
let's talk about the other regional player that seems to be the threat to the United States, Israel, and Egypt has been aligned with both of these countries on Iran. And so I want to ask you, and I'm seeing so many questions come. You've already sparked just a very active set of questions in the chat box, Ambassador. But I want to ask you, was it the right approach to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal in the JCPOA, known as the JCPOA, and to put the maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration did? Did you and your government see that as the most productive way to handle the Iranian threat?
Well, on Iran, let me just say that there's no love lost here between both Egypt and Iran. Ever since we've been on the course of peace in the Middle East, the Iranians have simply lost their conviction in this relationship, and as a result, we have also not been engaged with them in terms of trying to convince them. If you're not convinced, you're not convinced. So this is what we will be headed towards. Now, the JCPOA was an agreement that at the time we had our own assessments of it when it was first forged. And basically saying this, we cannot deal with the nuclear file, and this is our assessment, away from the other engagements of Iran in the region, playing with Arab assets in a way that is that only fuels much more instability. So we needed to see a JCPOA that is not confined to the nuclear file, that is not only confined to that file, away from the other files of missile capabilities and ballistic missiles.
Of course, I think I've answered the question on JCPOA. I think it's we think in Egypt that it's not just a nuclear file; it's the overall Iranian behavior in the region. And whenever we have a revamped JCPOA, I think it needs to take care of all the other Iranian involvement throughout the region, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq itself, which is also important, in Yemen, and so on and so forth. So the approach needs to be comprehensive when it comes to Iran.
Great. I want to get to a crucial question as we transfer toward what you might expect from the Biden administration, and that is to just discuss for the moment. This is a question from Rex Holman, that the events, the assault on the U.S. Capitol, and the spectacle and the damage that was done that left 5 people dead, that attacked American values when we were going through the process of certification of the Electoral College vote for President-elect Biden. How is that perceived in Egypt and in the region? And what do you think that means for America's image and soft power?
Well, absolutely. Well, thank you for the question. I've started off my initial remarks by offering condolences. I think that January 6th was a very sad day here in the US, but also globally. It confirmed what I had sensed ever since I arrived to Washington, a sense of not only political divide, but also a societal divide as well. There has been, in my several talks with a number of friends and new acquaintances, ever since I came, and actually what we've seen on the 6th was probably a culmination of fears that many have voiced on the future of the U.S. political system, but also on the U.S. society as a whole. So that has only confirmed what seems to be a massive divide amongst Americans here in the U.S. Well, and these events were unlike any I've ever seen here in the United States. It was shocking and disturbing, not only in the U.S., but also abroad. And let me say that, what is important here is probably to comment on the silver linings that are the U.S. political institutions and the processes themselves that exist here in the U.S. that will be able to redress the damage and to project an America in the image that everyone has always seen the U.S. But despite the imperfections again and the flaws in the U.S., I think it's only a model of democracy for the whole world. Its reputation, I think, will continue and will remain. The main thing is that despite these sad developments in in what had transpired on Capitol Hill, the ability of American institutions to overcome the divide and to bring the nation more to heal and to put the nation on a course that it has always been on is simply one that one needs to be cognizant of. I think there are a number of lessons learned, maybe, from what we've seen, and I think it comes to mind that a number of things, and these things might be controversial, but nevertheless, I would like to voice them. Number one is that freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the whole gamut of freedoms is not absolute. And I think this is a lesson learned from what we've seen. These rights and freedoms, they start and they end at a point where other rights start and end. And other rights, not only in terms of personal rights, but also in terms of the rights of the nation, and what are the rights of the society, the rights of communities. And this brings to mind here the notion of public order. So this is number one. Number two is there is an absolute need to preserve the right of demonstrators and protesters as long as they are peaceful. And this brings to mind the need to be more vigilant and more on guard when it comes to or let me just rephrase, vigilant and on guard when you are confronting insurgency into peaceful protests and demonstrators. And these insurgencies are basically what? Rioters, hooligans, and looters. And this is where the third element comes in, which is security. So security is important and is paramount to safeguard institutions and to safeguard the rights of the people as they demonstrate and peacefully voice their concerns. So these are the three things that I think are important, and these are the lessons learned. But also there's a fourth element that comes to mind, and also all of these are probably, I don't know, controversial or not, but they'll probably be subject to a lot of debate here in the US when it comes to the national alignment that we've seen here in the US against what has transpired in Capitol Hill. So there is this kind of dominant narrative across the board. And it's important to see this because when it comes to your identity, to your symbols of democracy, to your unity, there is no room to allow for these elements to be present and to be living their lives normally amongst yourselves. And to the extent that a number have referred to what has happened as local terrorists. So this gives you an example of how, national alignment, national unity amongst pundits, amongst the media, amongst think tankers and different circles here and amongst political leaders is important when it comes to direct threat to your being and your national identity and to your symbol of democracy.
I want to shift to Egypt. I know Egypt has had experience with mass demonstrations, including, we are at the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square. In terms of what the Biden administration might do, and it will be constrained to some extent because Obviously, it has a massive job with combating the COVID crisis and rolling out the vaccine much better. It has the economic consequences of that public health crisis to deal with. And now with what happened on January 6th and the erosion of confidence in US democracy and its electoral process, we'll be focused on that too. But Congress now in just Democratic control with a 50-50 split +1 with the Vice President Harris's breaking the tie, along with NGOs and international organizations that pay attention to Egypt on questions about rights and freedom. So you have Freedom House saying in its 2020 report that Egypt is not free. You have Transparency International on corruption saying that Egypt ranks 106 out of 180 countries. You have Reporters Without Borders saying that Egypt ranks 166 out of 180 countries. And you have members of the US Congress very upset still that there are dual citizens, American Egyptians, who are being held in your prisons on what they argue are politically motivated charges. How is Egypt coming to grips with the human rights question that it has been in the limelight for?
Well, absolutely. Well, Egypt, a great question. Let me just say that Egypt is undergoing huge transformation. We've made a number of strides in terms of the progress of the society itself when it comes to rights and freedoms. Let me just say, and this is not a talking point, let me just say that you just have a glance at the Egyptian constitution. And I know many have told me that, well, the constitution is something and the practice is something else. But this is important because the amount of freedoms and the amount of liberties that any society enjoys is also a function of its political and social transformation. So as we look at the Constitution, and when you look and see that the Constitution in itself, in its different articles, is the most progressive constitution when it comes to rights and freedoms, but also obligations to the citizens of Egypt, you will only grasp how an advancement this society has made. Look at the US Constitution itself and look how long it took you to normalize your social contract in the US. And look how it took to have your 10 amendments form what is called the Bill of Rights today. It takes a little bit of time, but it also, as it takes time, you should be, and Egypt is actually, cognizant of its own imperfections, it's cognizant of its own flaws and its own deficiencies. And as an important element, as you advance forward, you need to recognize it, as everyone does. And what we've seen lately is that not only no one is perfect or nobody is perfect, but you've seen a society that had in Egypt a National Council for Human Rights, which has had recommendations, some of which the government has embraced and others has not yet embraced. And that led the government actually to form a Supreme Council today to put in place a strategy on the promotion and protection of human rights. And this is actually ongoing these days, and hopefully very soon we will see this strategy out. Basically, this is a government body. It encompasses all institutions that have a relationship with rights and freedoms in general. It aims at coordinating. It aims at putting in place policies based on that strategy that is being formulated today. So, do we claim to be perfect? The answer is no. Do we recognize that there is much more room and much more to do in terms of preserving and protecting the rights. Yes, we do. We recognize that. And this in itself is indicative of the renewed approach the government in Egypt has towards human rights. In the past, we rarely recognized imperfections or flaws. And today, you will find a narrative in Egypt that is basically focused on the flaws and the imperfections in the whole human rights architecture and structure in Egypt. So are we moving forward? Yes, we are. Is it a slow process? Yes, it is a slow process, but we need to be more, how can I say, committed to the overall policy that we have put in place. So nobody's perfect, yes. Everyone has flaws. Everyone has imperfections, but where is the general trajectory? I think it indicates a positive outcome.
There's no question that nobody would be able to claim we're anywhere near perfect in this country either. But I would say, even from a more, let's say, practical, pragmatic approach, you know, it was a year ago, and this is the last question I'll ask on this, but it was a year ago tomorrow that the dual national Mustafa Qassem died after a 2-year hunger strike. And there are 2 other individuals who currently are in prison, who are detained, Khaled Hassan and Muhammad Amasha. And these 2 individuals, one is a 23-year-old medical student, the other is a limo driver from New York. Wouldn't it make sense to release them and have that undergird a relationship with the Biden administration to address some of the regional issues and some of the counterterrorism threats and other dealings with rival powers that you see?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's important to know that some of these cases, it's unfortunate that Muhammad Qassem, I think, Mustafa Qassem has died in his prison cell. It's definitely disheartening and a sad development. But when you look at these cases, one must realize and recognize that, first of all, you have one that has been released. One of the names that you've given now has been released, was Muhammad Amasha, I think, and the other name still is in prison. Some of these cases are related to terrorism, and they have solid, relations that have been proven with terror cells and terror organizations. It's a bit difficult to foresee a situation whereby you release people who have been implicated in terror plots. But nevertheless, there is heightened attention to these individual cases, and there's at the same time little room to maneuver when it comes to cases of terror. And this is what I'll say on this. But overall, let me just say that the situation of individual cases and a number of, I've had a number of conversations with congressional members and others on specific cases. And let me say that, I'm not the public prosecutor's office here. I do not have access to documentation. I do not have access to evidence. I do not have access to anything that would let me be in a position to answer specifics on specific cases. But I know that the public prosecutor's office is independent, and the investigations the office conducts are independent investigations under independent investigative judges. So So yes, there needs to be, in the overall picture of rights and freedoms, there needs to be more advancement, and we recognize that. And the society as a whole, as it advances, it is also uh, very cognizant of the fact that there are some of these imperfections that need to be addressed and need to be addressed seriously. And hopefully very soon, when we have our strategy out, things will move in a much quicker, on a much quicker pace.
Let's move to other matters of diplomacy, and it is the 42nd anniversary of the Camp David Accords. And we've seen some movement in the Middle East of other nations after Egypt's first example, and then Jordan, of course, a few years later. But with the Abraham Accords, the UAE and Bahrain and others have started to formalize relations with Israel. There's a warmth. Where is that leading toward peace in the region, and how much has Egypt been involved in encouraging those things?
Well, we've been involved. We've been the very first to welcome. We've been the very first to embrace. We think that the spirit of peace needs to prevail, and we were, as you've mentioned, the seed planters from the very beginning. Was 16 years later that Jordan has hopped on the peace train, and 26 years later, when UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan and Morocco have realized that this is probably the best way to move ahead. And as we have, weathered, as I've mentioned in my initial remarks, the backlash, and as we stood firm in our conviction, we've been able to transform mindsets. And as we have transformed them, others came on board. Now, as we project into the future, I think we should be able to build on the peace that has come into effect lately in terms of tackling the basic problem, which is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think we are using the new atmosphere here in terms of as a I don't say as a catalyst, but maybe as an opportunity to move ahead with the peace negotiations, or at least laying the grounds for the peace negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The problem that might arise in the very near future is that there will be elections in Israel very soon, and in summer there will be elections in Palestine as well. So there will be enough time from now until summer for us to put the ideas together and to create an atmosphere whereby maybe basic confidence building measures could be in place. So we will continue to work on peace. We also will continue on reconciling the Palestinian factions, and we will also continue to do our role when it comes to whenever escalation happens, to calm down the situation again between the Israelis and the Palestinians in Gaza. We've lately had, yesterday actually, we had the Munich core group in Cairo, basically exchanging ideas on how to be more progressive in terms of putting the basic tenets of what we think could be the road ahead. But the Palestinians as well, they need to be able to put their vision together of a two-state solution. I think that the two-state solution remains the only viable solution to the conflict, and they should be able to have a lead in terms of putting on the table, when time permits, their vision of the future.
It doesn't seem to be the view of the think tank community here, by and large, that the two-state solution is what you say, because the occupation of the West Bank continues. There's more building and construction there. And I think until that ceases, people are not going to
Mm-hmm.
really believe in the prospect of the two-state solution.
Yeah.
I want to
Well,
say that your relationship with Israel has blossomed in some ways, perhaps not so much in the people-to-people realm, but in the development of gas fields in the Mediterranean. We have a question from David Edick that wants to know your perspective on the deep water natural gas developments there, what that means for your collaboration with Israel, and also what it means for relations with Turkey.
mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the question. You know, the recent gas discoveries have unleashed a lot of potential in terms of also looking at it in terms of dividends of peace. Had there not been this peace between Egypt and Israel, probably the EMGF, which is the Eastern Mediterranean gas forum that we have initially proposed and been the driving force behind it coming into being, wouldn't have happened. But it has happened because of the peaceful relations that we've been strongly attached to, and as you know, it comprises that gas forum 7 countries from the region. It is a forum that would probably also lead Egypt to be, you know, an energy hub in the region as gas discoveries continue, but also oil discoveries as well. But we've also been doing so in a fashion that has put in parallel the need to keep on moving ahead with the renewables in Egypt. And we have today probably one of the largest solar parks in terms of renewable energy in Binban, which is in close to Aswan in Upper Egypt. And we continue with programs and projects in terms of wind, in generating power from wind and from water. So the renewables, as well as the traditional oil and gas, will continue in Egypt. And it also, when you look at the EMGF, you will find both Israel and the Palestinians who are part of it, which is also something that caters to a spirit of peace in the region. When it comes to Turkey, well, Turkey knows exactly what to do to be a constructive partner in the region. There are a lot of policies of Turkey that we disagree with, and Turkey needs
including Libya.
Of course, Libya is prime here. That Turkey needs to revisit and relook at and correct its courses when it comes to its overall policy in the region.
It's been very positive to see the countries in the GCC, namely Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Egypt, and the UAE, have this recent rapprochement with Qatar, against whom there's been a blockade. I wonder how you see that developing and whether the GCC will emerge to be the organization that it was on the trajectory to be, even in absence right now of a written agreement that would give people more confidence that that's the path ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've had serious differences with Qatar. There has been ongoing efforts on the part of Kuwait to mediate for the past year at least, and with, of course, an interest by the U.S. administration as well in forging some kind of detente, some kind of breakthrough when it comes to the Gulf plus Egypt rift with Qatar. And we've been able to, spell out in a document that has been signed in Riyadh the spirit that needs to prevail, and it will be for at least us in Egypt, it will be a testing kind of mode. Qatar needs to exhibit that it lives up to what it needs to do and its obligations according to what has been signed. So hopefully the new spirit that we see will be reflected and translated into concrete actions in terms of Qatar reversing course and playing a much more constructive role in the region.
Great. This question comes from Dwayne Rice Mason, and it is: what do you think of building desalination plants on Egypt's Red Sea coast and piping the water to the Nile Valley cities as a way to avert war between Egypt and Ethiopia? So this goes to one of the questions you raised in your opening remarks about the so-called GERD Dam, the Nile Dam known as Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And why don't you elaborate on that before we have one final question to close?
Well, absolutely. I mean, desalination projects are in fact ongoing in Egypt. The problem with the desalination projects that they are extremely expensive. They are very, very expensive and have and need a lot of resources. But nevertheless, we've been on projects of desalination, whether in Red Sea or on the Mediterranean coast as well. So as we move ahead with them, the need to be cognizant of the environmental threats of the GERD and the threat to the downstream of the dam is something that needs or keeps us aware of the need to look into other viable options and to be open to all options, including desalination.
Ambassador Zaran, we have 13 more questions that I have not been able to ask you, and we certainly don't have even 3 minutes, let alone another half hour. You've been very generous with your time, but I want to ask you to say a few final remarks on the perspective, what's going on in Egypt and how that may resonate with Americans and around the world. And that is, you have a new parliament taking shape at the end of this month, I believe, and I'd like you to address what you think the legislative priorities will be, what the Sisi government will try to accomplish with the Biden administration. And lastly, Egypt's soft power in the world, with tourism obviously shattered by COVID and so important to your economy with its treasures and its attractions. How do you see Egypt coming out of that difficulty?
Well, thank you, Bill, very much. I think this conversation has been extremely, interesting to both of us and the audience as well. The new Egypt that we're embarked on is one that is extremely, progressive in its approaches. If you take a look, and these are the untold stories here in Washington. There are a lot of stories happening in Egypt that do not find attention here in Washington. Maybe probably because of interests, a specific interest in certain files as opposed to the overall progress that is happening. But if you look at the economy in Egypt, for example, the economy and all the strides in the economy and the developments in the economy is extremely impressive. During COVID, we've had a growth rate of 3.6%. And if that is indicative of anything, is probably indicative of a solid economic reform program that we've been able to adopt for the past 3 years, and we continue to implement. One that has fiscal, monetary, and structural aspects of the reform. And all this has given resilience to the economy in Egypt. In Egypt today, there are a number of projects. We've been badly hit by COVID, as everyone else, and Egypt is no exception. Tourism is one, small and medium enterprises is another, the aviation industry, the health sector, and all these sectors were badly hit. But nevertheless, we've been able to cope by issuing in part by issuing a stimulus package of around 2% of our GDP, 100 billion Egyptian pounds, that caters basically to the most affected sectors and also the most vulnerable of in the society. We've been able, despite the uncertainties of the second wave, we've been able, at least through the past year, to weather the negative ramifications and consequences of COVID. But we've also been able to continue on a path of development. And the development path here is in mega projects as well as in small and medium term enterprises. Mega projects, we're building 14 cities in tandem. It's not just the new administrative capital that 14. Some here. 14, 1-4. In tandem. It's not just the administrative capital that some here in Washington seem to be skeptical about, but anyhow, these projects are also extend to interconnectivity projects, roads, bridges, tunnels, in terms of hospitals, schools, in terms of also the comprehensive strategy that we have in Sinai in confronting the terror cells that operate up in Sinai. It's not just a security aspect that we're confronting them with, but also economic and social, with huge projects that are happening and taking place in Egypt. We also have the new Suez Canal waterway that also has been hit by COVID in terms of the revenues, and the remittances of Egyptians abroad have also come down. But nevertheless, the new economic zone or corridor, as we would like to see, is also providing a lot of positive engagement in the economy itself, and has prospects to lead in terms of the economy. So Egypt has been doing very well. It's focused on renewables, as I said. It is also cognizant of the need to mitigate changes in climate and climate change, and the impact on environment as well. This is high on Egyptian agenda, and I think these are issues that are also high on the agenda of the next administration that we could also work on. So as we look for the next administration in Washington, we think that there are huge areas of non-traditional cooperation that could lead us to forge much more a collaborative kind of a relationship, other than the traditional peace, security, and stability that we've always had in the past. Culturally, let me just say that hopefully by the end of this year, we'll be able to announce the date of the opening of the Grand Egyptian Museum, which will be the largest in the world on the globe. And it will be a fascinating time, and I think we are all in Egypt and abroad. I want to tell you that the amount of inquiries that I'm getting here at the embassy and my colleagues are on that date and when will it happen is monumental, to use a word that relates to history and also to artifacts and museums. So hopefully this gem, as we call it, the Grand Egyptian Museum, will be inaugurated this year. It was supposed to be last year, but because of COVID, it was delayed. And hopefully a second wave of COVID will vanish soon with the vaccines out, and we will be able to announce a date and to witness this interesting and historic event.
When do you expect to be receiving travelers in any number? Would it be the fall, or, I mean, not for the museum, but generally for the post-COVID recovery of tourism?
Well, actually, Egypt is open.
Yeah.
But the flow of visitors has not been as high as we wanted because of COVID. So once COVID is behind our backs, you will find the traffic to and from Egypt much higher than today.
Well, perhaps during the World Affairs Councils of America's national conference, which we are intending to be in person in November, you can come join us and have some of your colleagues present about the GEM.
Of course.
And have our leaders and members learn more about it and the opportunities in Egypt. Also, as you know, there are 90 councils around the country in our association, and I'm sure many of my colleagues would love to host you virtually as we're doing these days, but also when it is time that we can travel again, that you would visit our cities and present to those communities.
Well, thank you very much. I'll definitely be looking forward to that, and I want to end by thanking you for hosting me and looking forward to our future interactions.
Ambassador Motaz Zahran, thank you very much. He's the Ambassador of the Arab Republic of Egypt to the United States. This is Bill Clifford saying thank you for joining us for this edition of Embassy Row Live, and we will be back to you very shortly, and keep doing the great work you're doing to support our civil society. We need it now in this country, and thank you for those of you who are participating in the World Affairs Councils of America's fundraising campaign through January 15 this Friday. We are 85% towards our target. If you can support us, you'll be helping support the council effort nationwide, and don't forget also to support your local World Affairs councils. Thanks very much. Again, Ambassador Zahran, have a very nice day. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to working with you again soon.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.
Stay safe.
Have a good afternoon.